please join me in welcoming to Google New York, Adam Braun. Adam and I were chatting a bit before you guys came in, and I was telling him that this book is it's an amazing story. It really captures the spirit of the organization and how it was started. But I thought something that was a really interesting thread throughout the book was this kind of exploration journey, internal and also throughout the world. Can you tell me how that started for you?
It's a great question. So for those that aren't familiar with the book, it's first and foremost the story of turning $25, which is how I started the organization, into now more than 200 schools globally. But along the way, it provides the guiding steps to a life of both success and significance. And I think for a long time, previous to the kind of current era, you almost have to choose one or the other. You could have what we deemed success or kind of more purpose or meaning and philanthropy in your life. And nowadays, there's this beautiful intersection that's occurring. And so the book is really written to help individuals find their own path to achieving both. And it's framed around 30 mantras. So every chapter is a very short, kind of quick vignette, an individual story, and they're titled with these mantras that are guiding steps, like essential truths that I found helpful over the years, and I would kind of write in journals or on whiteboards. And one of them is get outside of your comfort zone, or get out of your comfort zone. And I think it speaks to the question that you asked, because I think part of it is maybe because I was a middle child, and middle children, you're given the freedom to explore, because people are paying attention to your oldest and your younger siblings.
As a middle child,
yeah,
too.
Yeah, you have this recognition pretty early on that you have a freedom that's afforded to you by virtue of your birthplace. And I started to, really in college, I think, recognize when I was a sophomore or junior, I started to get into music really heavily. And I decided for a semester or two that I was just not going to buy any of the textbooks that my classes assigned. And I spent the money instead on creating my own curriculum. And that meant that I bought all of these biographies of the Rolling Stones and the band and Bob Dylan and some of the other musicians that I was into, and I decided to kind of read their life stories, as well as some of the really influential books that you're almost like supposed to read in your early 20s. What I found was that the artists that I really revered, when I looked at their history of their music, they never created great music or art or literature during periods of contentment. It was never when things were going well and they were kind of like happy and peaceful that their greatest songs were written. It was always during periods of struggle. It was like, culture was at odds in some way, shape, or form. There was societal unrest. They had just had their heart broken, maybe. There was a passing, some level of adversity. And that's when these explosive creative breakthroughs happen. And so at that point in time, I was a sophomore going on becoming a junior, and I was playing basketball at Braun and had a girlfriend, and I was really happy with my life. And for some reason, I was like, I just need to be uncomfortable. I have to find a way to just get out of my comfort zone, and that led me to go on semester at sea, and on semester at sea, a series of things happened that I think changed my perspective pretty drastically on how I wanted to spend my life. But it was that kind of recognition of how those that I had admired most had lived their lives that led me to this kind of exploratory nature.
It's interesting that you talk about the semester at sea, because that's actually my next question. Request is, in the book and also in speeches that Adam has given, he talks about the semester at sea experience. And it is not the idyllic semester at sea experience. And can you just talk to us a little bit, briefly kind of tell everybody what your experience was like?
Yeah, so for those that aren't familiar, semester at sea is a cruise ship that goes around the world, and you most of the time stop in anywhere from 8 to 13 countries. Every voyage has a slightly different itinerary, but my year was supposed to be 10 different countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And I'm part of one of the 3 famous voyages. And you don't get famous on semester at sea unless something goes really wrong. So my ship left from Vancouver, headed towards South Korea, January 2005, and while crossing the North Pacific, and it was the very first time that they had gone that route. They always went kind of the other direction. But they had a brand new ship my year, and they decided that it was okay to cross the North Pacific in winter. And 3 major storm fronts developed. We tried to go underneath, and another one developed underneath us, and we got caught in essentially a superstorm. And there's a 30-minute Storm Stories episode just on my ship that's on YouTube that you can look up. But we were struck by a 60-foot rogue wave about 800 miles from land. And it went over the top of our ship, and it shattered the glass on the 6th floor bridge, which housed all the navigational equipment and the power to our engines. And so we lost all power to our engines while in 45-foot swells, surrounded by freezing cold hypothermic water. And I had a certain death experience. I mean, the panicked announcement came, telling us get to the 5th floor or higher, help the women and children up the stairs, keep on your life jackets, and get to your muster stations. And for those that aren't familiar, a muster station is where you evacuate a ship from. So we were basically told, without saying it explicitly, the ship's going down and you have to evacuate. And I'm looking out at small mountains of freezing cold water with no ability to get into lifeboats. And so I was sure I was dying in the next hour. There was no doubt in my mind. Went through the emotional experience of that. And about 30 or 45 seconds, and I try and detail it in the book, but it's hard to articulate it all.
You do a good job.
Thanks. I just had this total calm, stillness settle over me, and it was recognition, not like belief or hope, but recognition that I was not going to perish. I just knew it. And within that recognition, there was the knowledge that, okay, if I'm not meant to die today, then there's something else that gives me that knowledge, which is purpose. That my life is not meant to be a 21-year-old man perishes at sea, that I have some purpose in being here. And from that point forward, I just became relentlessly committed to the pursuit of individual purpose, and sought to find what that thing was, and eventually other experiences led me to find it, and then it manifested into this organization, Pencils of Promise.
From that kind of purpose, that moment of like, I'm here for a reason, I'm here for a purpose.
And I believe that about every single person. And I think every single person, anyone who is sitting in this room or watches this online, I distinctly believe that you have an individual purpose. Your existence is for a reason. And ultimately, the most powerful thing that you can do is discover what that is and then live it fully, because then you become unstoppable.
I like that. It's very cool. So the ship almost went down. It didn't go down.
Right.
Thankfully.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
Survived.
So yes, you survived. Thank God. And I guess, the organization was started, or at least was created from this question that you were asking kids of, what do you want most if you could have one thing, what would it be? Why did you start asking that question? Do you remember?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I've always found that it's better to come in as a listener than a speaker. And I'm naturally introverted, and I was not comfortable going up to strangers and starting up a conversation, but at the time, I think, when you're a college kid, you almost envision like your cool idea of what your dorm room is going to be. And when you go on semester at sea, you almost know that everyone does one thing per country. Like they got a beer cap from each country, or a t-shirt, or they take a photo with like a Beanie Baby in front of a tourist spot. And yeah, you know what I'm talking about, like people really did that.
Yeah,
and so I decided that rather than having push pins of where I went, I'd always been interested in kids and worked with kids. And so I thought, let me ask one child in each country that I go to, what do you want most in the world? And this way I can start a conversation with anybody just by asking a question, and I'll have them write it down on a piece of paper, and then when I get back, I'll have this collage of global interests. But I assumed they were going to be the material things that I wanted. I thought it was like, a kid in China is going to want a house, and a kid in Brazil is going to want a professional soccer team. And it was all these like big material ideas that were worth lots of money. And I detail in the book, but the first answer I got was to dance. The young girl said, no, you can have anything at all. Then her answer was to dance. Then in China, it was a book. Girl hadn't owned a book before. In Hong Kong, it was magic, which I thought was my favorite. Cool. And then in India, where this boy was begging on the street, and I thought, okay, he's going to be my one kid, his answer was a pencil. And it was just such a disarming answer. And when I gave him my pencil, he was so excited. And at that point, I realized for the first time in my life that there were kids that lived without any access to quality education, which is the one thing that lifted my family out of poverty, from Holocaust survivors in a rural village on a countryside, to the life that I was able to live, going to a good school and great public education system.
2 generations.
Yeah. And so I thought, maybe this is my purpose, is to help create a world in which every single child on earth, regardless of where you're born, regardless of your socioeconomic status, has access to quality education.
So after you went on this amazing journey, and you went back, you got a job at Bain, right? That was the first job.
Yeah.
And then you started your organization during that process.
Mhm.
Looking back, if you were to do it a different way, would you? Or would you go back and do it the same?
So I think if I wanted to create a more successful organization, larger in scale, or impacted more lives than we have thus far, as a what would be second-time entrepreneur, I've learned a lot along the way, and so I realistically would have taken the advice that I got, which I speak about in the book, from one of my mentors, George, who said to me, "This is a very tough period." It was late 2008. A bunch of companies had just declared bankruptcy. Everyone was losing their jobs in New York. It was not a good time for philanthropic capital. And he said to me, "You cannot build an organization off of small donations from young people, especially through like this social media thing you keep on telling me about." And so he said, "Go with 5 donors who can give you $50,000 each, and you have 250 grand in startup capital, and then you can hire a team and build from there." And if I was knowing what I know now, I probably would go in and say, "Yeah, I should get a bunch of high net worth individuals and get a bunch of capital, and then you can springboard from that point forward." But I was so committed to proving that any person can create something of large scale change that I was willing to go into a bank and say, "What does it take to start a bank account?" And they said $25 to open up something at Bank of America. And so I put $25 in. Because one, I didn't have a lot of money, and two, my friends certainly had no money at the time. And I wanted to prove that this could be done. And so...
You were 24 at the time?
Yeah, it was my 25th birthday that launched the organization. And so...
And $25.
Right. And so if I was purely committed to building the organization, maybe I would have done it a little bit differently, but the ambition has never been to solely make Pencil of Promise successful. It's to change the thinking that people have around philanthropy, what we call nonprofits, and I like to call for-purpose organizations, and to hopefully inspire people and then provide them with the tools and ability to to create their own extraordinary journey that fulfills their sense of purpose.
So with that $25 that you started,
Yeah.
Besides that, and I guess almost more advice to people that are maybe interested in starting their own side organization or organization,
Yeah.
what else are the bare bones that you think that you need to start an organization? You can forget the 5 giant
Right.
giant $50,000 donations, but what
Yeah.
are like the bare bones that you would advise the people to have?
So there's a lot, but if I was to distill it into, let's say, 3 things.
Yeah.
The first one is you have to have knowledge that it's going to work. And I'm not talking about hope, and I'm not talking about belief. You have to be completely delusional about the fact that your idea is going to succeed, because you're going to hear no, or that's nice, but I'm not interested, 99.9% of the time. Even to this day, I hear 99.9% of the time, I explain to somebody what we do, and they make a choice not to support Pencils of Promise, just by their own volition. So
You'll hear no way more than you hear yes.
Right. And so the first is, you can't think it's a good idea. You have to genuinely believe that no matter what anybody else says, this thing has to succeed. And that, again, when it comes from a place of purpose, which is beyond passion, that's step number 1. The second one is, there's a chapter called Find the Impossible Ones, which is, you need to find your tribe. And I really advocate for people almost creating an underdog sense around your organization or your company or your idea. Because people rally around underdogs. There's a reason that we watch March Madness. It's not in hopes that the final bracket is 1-1-1-1. It's that we want to see 8s play against 15s, and 15s win and somehow make it. Like, that's the stories that we love and the stories that we tell. And so, as much as people told me this is impossible, I thought, well, that's great. I'm going to create a tribe. Like, our team is going to be people that embrace that idea. And so you have to have like-minded individuals who become your early adopters, because otherwise you're just like a lunatic preaching something that nobody else believes in. And then the third one is, I genuinely believe that you have to combine business acumen with the ideals that found your company, whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit. But I've seen way too many failed projects, nonprofit or for-profit, because people go into the space with purely passion and they're not equipped with business acumen. And I think that more than anything, that's what's enabled us to succeed, is the training that I had working at like a hedge fund when I was 16, or Bain out of college. It differentiated me in the space, and the reason that we were successful in our programs is because the business acumen drives what we do. It's not just pretty pictures and a flashy website.
Yeah. So in the midst of all of this growing in it's an amazing organization. Why did you decide to write a book now? Like, what was the motivation?
So there's a few things. The first was that I had a lot of people coming to me and asking the natural question of saying, I have an idea, and how did you turn 25 bucks into this big organization? Can you just sit with me for 30 minutes? And after I did a bunch of these phone calls and meetings, I found that I was often inspired by the feedback that I was getting from them, but I didn't have the time or the ability to give them all the advice that I wanted. So the first thing was literally to create like a guidebook for any other individual to pursue their thing, whatever that might be, side job within a company, something entrepreneurial. But I read a lot of these great books, and they were purely inspiring narratives, and they didn't have the how-to element. So that was the first thing, was I wanted to show people how they could go and do it. And then the second one was that I wanted the organization to continue and scale its impact. And either I could get on a plane and try and speak on every stage possible, or I could write something that somebody else could hand to somebody else and say, oh, you want to learn about this organization? Read this book. And as part of that, all proceeds from the book go back into the organization. And so it made it a very easy decision for somebody to say to another individual, hey, if you're interested in learning about a great organization, here's the pop book, and this will provide you with the full background and the ability to either get involved with this organization or to discover your own passion and pursue it.
From the time that this idea came up to the time it was published, how long was the process of writing it?
So, one of my bucket list items was to write a book, just because I think that it outlives the individual, and it was just a cool idea that 100 years from now, there'll be some digital library that Google has created, and this book will be in the digital library that people can go and see with their robot eyes. So the idea has been there for a long time, but the actual process of writing was quick. I kind of mapped it out with my co-writer Carly over no more than really 3 months. And then I took a sabbatical last year, and with my fiance and just a backpack each, we did a round the world trip for a little bit more than 3 months. And I brought a computer in the backpack. And so I would write most days and send my draft back to Carly, and she would give me her little revisions and be like, pull out this story and more description here, and really guide me through it. And so the entire manuscript was actually written in 3 months, which is really fast.
That's incredibly fast.
Yeah, and the original manuscript was 81,000 words. The final book is 66,000. So, a fair amount was actually cut out, but that was because I wanted it to be an easy read. I wanted it to be something that you could pick up in the airport on a flight cross country and read by the time that you landed.
Yeah, I think I read it in 2 days.
Yeah, that's been the most consistent feedback thus far. Is I've read your book in no more than 3 days for most people. It's like a weekend read or a flight read, or they're on the beach for the afternoon and they just tear through it.
Yeah, it's a great read. Something that you talked about earlier, or brought up, that I thought was really clever in the book is the way the chapters are named after mantras.
Yeah.
Why did you decide to name them after mantras?
So somebody asked me at one point, there were 650 or there were 700 students that went on your semester at Sea Voyage. What was it that was different about you that you came back with not only this feeling, but then you converted intention into action? And the truth is, if I think about what led to it, I think it was the fact that I just really adopted mantras. And so I've always had one powerful phrase that guides my decision making, and it's tough to have a set of values that you live by if there's 8 of them. But I think it's really simple if you find one essential truth that you almost treat as the guiding principle that you make all your decisions around. And I find that oftentimes I discover one phrase, or I come up with one phrase, and that feels right for that period of my life. And so given that I found these phrases so helpful in my decision-making process, I thought, the way that we consume media nowadays is really different. So we want 140 characters that describe something, and then we want the ability to click in and expand. And so when I read, most of the time it's tough for me to read a whole book. I don't know about you guys, but I'm there's probably 8 books right now that I'm between 50 and 100 pages through. And I just kind of get bored, and then I put it down. I'm like, all right, I get the general principle. And so the one thing that I do stick with is short stories. And so I listen to Moth podcasts, and I watch TED Talks, and I like episodes of House of Cards and Game of Thrones, and I like to watch 3 if I want, or 1. So I thought, why can't you write a book with that same ideology, the same kind of framework? So the mantras could be the quick way to access something, and I'm sure you would agree. Someone could pick up this book and read Mantra 13. alone, separate from the rest, and feel like they gain value.
Yeah.
And,
It's very true.
and so I wanted to write in the way that we consume media nowadays as well, like episodic versions. And ultimately, the mantras seemed like the best way to frame it.
It does feel like episodes. The book,
Yeah.
like each chapter does really feel like an episode. It's very,
Yeah, and I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday who's written a really fantastic book, and one of the things that I was sharing with him is that when I wrote the book, I was traveling for 3 months, and I wanted to read great books while I was, traveling. And what I found is that there was, and I won't name it, there's one book that was an international bestseller on a topic I'm so interested in. But as I read it, it was really dense. It was like a textbook, and it wasn't enjoyable for me to read. But when I thought about the books that I did enjoy, they were kind of these page turners that left little hooks at the end of a chapter when I'd want to kind of put it down and go get lunch. I'd almost be like, but wait, I need to know what happens next because he or she previewed what's about to happen. And so selectively, it probably happens 6 or 7 times throughout the book, but at the end of a chapter, I would just kind of plug in what's coming next and then paint that scene in the next paragraph on the side page. And I found that it's really enabled people to kind of like watch the next episode, if that makes sense.
yeah. What was your biggest discovery writing this book?
I think the biggest discovery was how valuable failures are. I got to a point about maybe 6 weeks before the book went to physical print, where I had one final ability to edit the material. And at that point in time, you're really only supposed to be editing a few words, maybe a sentence here and there. And there's a chapter called Fess Up to Your Failures, which is about a point in time where I really acted like a jerk to our staff. Basically, 2 of our staff members were held up at knife point and robbed and kind of roughed up, a man and a woman, in Guatemala. And they were in a community that they really weren't supposed to be in, and it was after like a Super Bowl party. And so they emailed me saying we were roughed up and our passport and our wallets and our mobiles were stolen. And I thought that they wanted reimbursement, and then I pretty much emailed them back and said, I'm so sorry that this happened, but we're not going to reimburse you because we value every dollar and you made the decision to go into this place. And I really felt like I was protecting Pencils of Promise, when in fact, I was actually damaging the individuals which make up the organization. The organization is nothing more than a collection of people, and they were really offended by it, and they were like, we weren't even asking for reimbursement, we just wanted to notify you that this happened. And I really had to take a kind of rough internal look and say, all right, what type of leader do I want to be? And was really apologetic to them. And the whole chapter is about exclusively failure on a personal level. And 6 weeks before the book came out, I just decided to take out the chapter. Because I was like, I don't want to look like a jerk to the thousands of people that are hopefully going to read this book. And you're kind of worried about criticism. And there's other chapters. Practice Humility Over Hubris is also about where I made a mistake, but this one was like really being a jerk. And so I told the few people that had read it, including my publisher, that I'm taking out that chapter. And I told a few of our staff members, and there was an overwhelming response. At least 90% of the people that had read the book that I informed that I was taking out that chapter came back and said that was my favorite chapter in the book because it showed that you were human. And it showed that you make serious mistakes. And there was a line at the end of the chapter that said, we learn far more from the methods in which we address failure than the moments in the midst of success. And that line really resonated with people. And so I decided to put the chapter back in because of their feedback, and it's been one of the ones that people point to most. When I ask, what do you remember? They're like, the fact that you are so honest about your mistakes. And when I look at the Amazon reviews or any other review, that's consistent feedback, is the book is written with an honesty and a vulnerability. And that's something that I didn't expect going into it, that the failures would resonate so much with people rather than the successes.
I like that chapter too. I'm glad you kept it in.
I'm glad everyone loves when I was
It's good because I feel like it's kind of towards the end of the book too.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So it's like,
I think it's the 23rd or 24th chapter.
It's very cool. I mean, you're watching this rise of your organization, success, and you do have this kind of moment of humility. You know?
I mean, there's another chapter, Vulnerability is Vital, which is all about my fear of asking people for money. But 3.5 years in, I hadn't sat in front of one person and said, can you give $5,000 to the organization?
Which is amazing.
Right, I mean, I articulated a vision that I was delusional about, and still am, And people either chose to donate or not. And that was it, because I didn't want to ask anyone for money.
Yeah.
And then I recognized it was such a big weakness that it was holding back our growth. And that I needed to admit to my board of directors, which were these huge business leaders, that I was actually bad at something, not that I was great. And it was in the acknowledgement of that vulnerability that they said, okay, we want to invest in you getting better. And I went through the top course at Harvard, run by 2 global experts on this space. And the biggest thing that I realized is it was my sense of ego, that I was putting myself in the middle of the equation. That if I asked you for money, I felt like you were giving money to me. When in fact, you're actually supporting Nit and Nut and Tamund and some of our students in the field, and you're not giving money to me at all. You're facilitating their educational attainment. And once I learned to remove myself from the equation, it changed from an obligation or a fear to actually something that I felt honored to do, that I could be the steward for their educational attainment. And if you say no, you're not rejecting me, you're just not choosing to support them. And so it drastically changed my perception and approach to fundraising. But that only happened because I said, look, guys, I'm bad at this and I need your help. And so that was another chapter that it's later on in the book, like we're really successful by that point. And it was important for me to write and admit, like even when people on the outside think it's going well, there's still major areas of growth and improvement that are needed.
So on that same kind of idea of fundraising, social media has had a huge part of how you developed your organization.
Yeah.
Not to his point, you never asked directly for money. It was mainly through social media tools.
Yeah, peer-to-peer fundraising, events, stuff
Can you
like
talk a bit about that? How social media,
Yeah.
How you've used it to grow your organization?
Yeah, sure. So, we were one of the first organizations to really adopt social and digital, especially at a time when it wasn't being done. And so late 08 was, again, a tough economic period, especially in this city. So the perception was you can't waste your energy and time on this crowdsourcing, small donation, and like status stuff. You need to be kind of hunkering down and getting offline checks from major donors. And because I was Zuckerberg's year in college, she was a sophomore at Harvard and I was a sophomore at Braun when it launched, my friends were all on Facebook and then early adopters on pretty much every other platform. And so I had to make 2 early bets. And I think with any company, to the point of the Wayne Gretzky quote, you skate to where the puck is going, not where it is. And so my 2 early kind of bets were, one, that social media would become integral to the fabric of not just our daily lives, but business. And so if I could build one of the most engaged and largest social media followings around the organization, that would be a really valuable asset. And then the second was that cause marketing would become really important for large brands and startups. And that companies would recognize that consumers will change brands, if all things are equal, if one has a positive social impact, and the best way to do that is to partner with a beautiful, well-branded organization. And so with those 2 kind of ideas in mind, I focused for the first 3 years, not on high-level fundraising, but on building community. And now, I was on a call with, think of the most powerful and maybe well-known woman in the country, her office, yesterday. And the question that they asked is, how are you doing such an effective job of engaging young people and their families in particular? And I had a call also yesterday with a woman who runs a really large business, came to one of our events and said to me on the phone, something, I came to the event expecting to learn about you guys. I told my daughter I was going, and she was like, yeah, of course. How do you not know about Pencils of Promise? And it's the first time my daughter's ever informed me about an organization. And so I focused on creating an opportunity for other individuals to become heroes. Any kind of dissection of a great speech, if you really break it down, they usually share this hero's journey. This person comes up against an obstacle, they fall back, and then they overcome. Great speeches actually have the hero's journey as the core element, but it's not the speaker on stage who's the hero, it's the audience. And that's what eventually converts the audience into action, is the opportunity for them to kind of fulfill this destined promise. And so when I look at social media, the job is not to highlight my story, but it's actually to get other people to feel like their story can succeed through Pencils of Promise. And digital and social is the best way for us to enable it. And so that's always been our approach, is to make other people heroes.
You touched on cause marketing, and it's something that I'm really fascinated in, and I love that it's included in this book.
Yeah.
People that are in for-profit businesses, how do you think that they can, what advice do you have, or what what advice do you have for people that would want to incorporate cause marketing into their for-profit strategies?
Yeah, I mean, it's very simple. You will make more money by having positive social impact. There's just no doubt about it. I mean, all the data is behind it. If you look at the generational wealth transfer that's going to happen in the coming years, trillions of dollars are being transferred from basically baby boomers over to millennials. And millennials just have a clear preference to support products and goods and services that create a positive social impact. And so I advise companies to focus on what you do best, which is probably sell your product or service, but to partner with great organizations that do what they do best, which is, in our case, educating children. And so if that resonates with both your consumers and your employees, then find an organization that kind of fits your mission or ethos and enable them to do more great work, and they in turn can help you become more profitable. But part of the reason I don't like the term nonprofit is because we don't exist to not profit. We exist to create positive social impact. And there's this kind of traditional approach in the space that it's a one-way street. That because we work with people in poverty, like pity us as an organization and the people we serve, so you're kind of obliged to help us maybe. But I look at it as an equal value exchange. So Pencils of Promise can help people make a lot more money. And in doing so, we accomplish our mission, which is educate more children. And it should be perceived that way. I mean, our social media following is a valuable marketing asset that we can help both us and another company achieve mutual objectives, but it's really important to align up front and just be really clear and say, look, you're in this for X, we're in this for Y, and if both happen, both of us end up very happy, as well as your employees and your consumers.
I could talk to you for like another hour and a half, but I want to make sure we have some time for Q&A, so I'm going to just ask a couple more questions and then we'll turn it over. Basic is what's next for you?
The next thing is what we're calling our innovation pilots. So when we look at the organization, the mission was not to build schools. The mission was to help create a world in which every child has access to quality education. The good thing is we now have a distribution system of more than 200 schools. And when I think about all the changes that have happened in education since I started, there's some really fascinating stuff happening, but it's almost impossible to test it out domestically because it's either too expensive or you have entrenched interests like teachers unions and labor unions and parental groups and government-funded programs that can't push the bounds of innovation rapidly and at low costs, whereas we can. And so what we're doing is testing out innovations in education within 3 to 5 of our schools globally across the course of the next year. So next month, e-readers go into classrooms in Ghana, and we'll see what happens when you have e-readers for every single student in one school, and then a peer community doesn't have access to it, and what's the educational outcomes that are different because of it. Long-distance radio programming into rural Guatemala. We have 3D printers in Laos that are producing literacy toolkits, and then we're using sign language to teach early-stage phonetics, which is, like, in my mind, one of the most fascinating things that is going to happen in ed, period, and we're pushing it forward. And then there's a couple others that we're driving, and that's what I'm most excited about.
So on that, I'm gonna ask a couple questions of just like finish this sentence style. Okay. Keep it googly, keep it light. Yeah. And then we'll open it up for some questions.
Great.
So what inspires, I'm gonna say you, in your 10s when you finish. What inspires me the most is?
Listening to people's stories of fulfillment of purpose.
I am challenged by?
The people I surround myself with.
The food I miss most when I'm traveling is?
Chicken Parmesan. No doubt. Not a favorite food by far.
If I weren't running an NGO or a for-purpose organization, I would be?
Launching a different company that created the largest positive social impact possible.
Here at Google, we have something called moonshots. So my moonshot is the biggest idea you can possibly think of to make happen.
I mean, I don't even think this will happen. I know it will happen in my lifetime. Quality education for every child on earth.
When The Promise of a Pencil is made into a movie, the actor that will play me is?
Denzel Washington.
Amazing. Oh, that's fantastic. Okay, I want to open up to Q&A. There's a mic. Matthew has a mic.
Thank you for coming. first and foremost, I really like that you call attention to something that I've grappled with, which is the false dichotomy of doing well and doing good.
Yeah.
So that's fantastic. Having done some international travel and service work myself, I feel like when you go there to different countries, that being India or East Africa, or wherever you are just steeped in this sense of privilege, whether that be American privilege or white male privilege. What have you done with Instill of Promise when it comes to creating meaningful community partnerships to empower community members to be engaged in what you're doing versus what I think a lot of companies fall into being like the white savior complex and coming in and making those changes?
Yeah. So there's a really powerful story in the book, which is about when I was 23, I was in rural Guatemala, and a man approached me kind of by this lakeside and asked me to go live with him for a while, and I was like, what is this guy asking me to do? But I took him up on the offer because the mantra at the time was tourists see, travelers seek. And I went and I lived with him for 3 days, and he asked me to stay with him because he had a large tape cassette recorder and a Bible, and he wanted me to read his Bible into this tape cassette recorder. I couldn't really understand why. And then I came to realize he had a big set of headphones, and he was teaching himself English, and he was a teacher, and he couldn't pronounce English very well. So the goal was for him to listen to my voice, pronouncing the words properly, so he could teach himself to then teach his kids. Completely changed my philosophy on global development because he wasn't asking for a handout. He wanted the tools to self-educate and then pass it down to future generations. And so that's informed every one of the philosophies that's launched the organization. So, for example, we don't build schools on behalf of villages. Villages have to commit to 10 to 20, and now it's almost always 20% or more of the funding for every project that we undertake. They have no spare cash because it's $300 to $500 in annual income for the family in most communities where we work. So they make it up in materials and labor. So they collect the scrap wood, the gravel, the cement, and then more importantly, mothers and fathers and elders and siblings are physically building the schools. They provide almost all of the labor. In Ghana, it's 100% of labor is provided by the community. And that creates a sense of real ownership and investment because we don't do build trips, for example. Like if somebody asks me, can I go out and build a school and live in a village for 3 weeks? My answer is no, because I want these communities to build their own schools so that when it starts to break down, they don't say, hey, where was that college kid from Wisconsin that built my school because the piping's broken? It's, no, I built my son's school. It's starting to break down. I need to fix it, and he needs to make sure that he gets his butt in the classroom every day. And so there's a whole set of practices in place across the organization that ensure local ownership and sustainability.
Thank you. So it's sometimes difficult for somebody like me to get a vision of what these schools look like.
Yeah.
Right? Living in America.
Sure.
Can you tell us a story maybe of one of the schools, kind of paint a picture of what it's like on the kids, teaching kids, and sort of how you or people who work for your organization interact with they're there.
Sure. So we build between 1 and 6 classroom schools. So the first one was like a 1 classroom preschool, just getting started. Now most of the prep schools, I would say, are 4 to 6 classrooms. They serve anywhere between 100 and 200 kids. Once they're opened, most likely 1,500 to 2,500 kids over the life of that school. And they're quality materials. So it's rebar and cement. It would look like if you've been to any kind of developing world country and there's a quality structure there. They're usually 1 floor. In Guatemala, we'll build earthquake-proof 2 floors at times. But they're the nicest buildings, I would say, in the community, usually by far, but they're built completely for function. So I've seen other NGOs that spend a ton of money on huge bathrooms. It's more important for us to have a latrine for a boy and a girl separately, because oftentimes when girls start to go through their period, they drop out of school for those 4 days out of the month, and then they fall behind. So we built separate bathrooms. But the schools, let's see, they're all public schools, so they're under the Education Ministry's jurisdiction. The teachers are trained by the Education Ministry and then sent to the schools, but we realized that the quality of teaching wasn't as high as we wanted it to be, so we launched a teacher training program. That was our second program. And then we saw that when kids were completing our primary schools, most of the time, girls in particular were not continuing with secondary school because of small prohibitive costs, like $250 in total. So we launched a scholarship program, so that's our third program. And then most of our staff is international. So there's about 15 here in New York. There's almost 75 international, and more than 90% of them are from the countries in which they work. So it's Ghanaians leading Ghanaian staff working with Ghanaian children. It's not Westerners showing up and like passing out gifts. And oftentimes our staff actually comes from the rural countryside, and grew up in a bamboo hut or a mud hut or a kind of corrugated tin shack. And so they're about as familiar with it as it gets with both the needs and the preferences and the ideals of the communities.
Right.
So you just mentioned sort of some of the progressions that you've had, opening schools, training teachers, and you've also talked about, the end goal being quality education for all.
Yeah.
What's in 5 years? What's in 10 years for you?
Well, I bet some of the answers truthfully are housed here at Google. I think, so one of my mentors is a guy, Ray Chambers, who's probably most responsible at the end of the day for eradication of malaria. When gets to zero, Ray's done it more than anybody else. Co-founder of Malaria No More, just this incredible history of philanthropy. It's like Buffett and Gates and Ray's up. He's now the United Nations Special Envoy for Global Health, so he's responsible for achievement of the 4 Millennium Development Goals, and he joined our board. He's in the book as well. So the thing that I learned most from Ray was to ask yourself this question, which is to think about where the world is going in the next 10 years, what your goal will evolve to, as well as your resources and your networks over those 10 years, and play the most meaningful part in the world that you're trying to create over that period. And what I've seen him do so effectively is create a convening space for ideas and individuals. So they've raised $6 billion for eradication of malaria, which Ray has charged forward on. Malaria No More raises like $10 or $15 million a year, but they've been kind of this focal point that has rallied a community around collective ideas. And so when I think about the next 5 or 10 years, I know Pencils of Promise will not build enough schools to educate every child on earth. Even if we launch one of these innovation pilots that works, we're not the ones that are going to scale it out to reach every single child. But the ambition is to constantly push the space forward and play the most meaningful role possible in the end goal, which is quality education for all. And so I don't think we'll go into the advocacy space, but I can see some of our ideas being adopted through advocacy. And the biggest thing that we're going to provide value on is changing people's thinking around, one, the nonprofits, and hopefully shift it towards more of a for-purpose approach. And then secondly, the idea that like most nonprofits or for-purpose organizations in our space would commit to building 1,000 schools by 2017. Like that would be it. We could do 1,000 schools, but if that doesn't lead to the mission being solved, then we're not doing the right thing. And so my hope is that 5 years from now, we're doing something that I don't even know about. 5 years ago, there's no chance I would have told you about e-readers in classrooms because it just wasn't even an idea. And so my hope is we're almost like if you watch a baby walking, like they're almost falling forward, but they always somehow catch themselves. And the idea is to move the organization with that type of momentum.
Any questions?
Sure, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about your data-driven approach to solving things. It seems to be a common theme now in a lot of NGOs.
Completely. So I think the Gates Foundation has probably moved the space in that direction more than any other, because they've just applied so much rigorous data-driven monitoring and evaluation to the way that they issue grants, as well as Robinhood. Robinhood's about as data-driven as it gets. And so one of the things that's really important to us is that we're not purely driven by passion, but by a commitment to results. And so we track about 25 different metrics in every community after a school is open. So that's everything from teacher retention to student attendance to literacy progression, grade progression, numeracy. And what we're seeing is some really compelling data. So kids that go through classrooms where we've provided our teacher training outperform peer communities 3-1 on test scores. 85% of the communities where we work are reporting increases in literacy. And kids in Pencils of Promise schools are progressing from one grade to the next at 2 times the national average. And so that, to me, is what's truthfully most important. So this is a little bit jargony, but the nonprofit space always celebrates outputs. And so the output would be broke ground on 200 schools, 22,000+ kids in our classrooms. and 15 million education hours delivered. And those are nice, flashy stats, and people say, wow, that's really great. But the analogy of that would be for a company to purely be based on the amount of employees that they have. Or, I had a finance background, so it would be like someone saying, hey, I just launched an investment fund, and we have $25 million under management. Now, that's great, but all that matters is what's the performance of your investment strategy. So if you have 25 million under management, but you're down 30% on the year, you're not doing a good job. And yet the nonprofit space kind of has this free pass where people assume, oh, I gave $100, I got my $100 tax deduction, I did good in the world. And oftentimes that $100 is either used ineffectively, sometimes it has unintended consequences that are adversely affecting the communities. And so our commitment is to always stay held accountable to the results themselves. And so we kill programs often. I mean, we mapped out all of our programs, and we were doing something, it was called sister schools. So we were pairing together schools, low-income communities in the Bronx and Queens and parts of the city and parts of California with some of our schools internationally. And parents and individuals were like, can we do pen pals? We did it. We thought it was a great idea. Then when we mapped it out on a 2x2 and kind of did like consulting style work, we realized, all right, this is actually not advancing our mission very effectively. It's not advancing the fundraising component of the organization, and it's a huge effort on behalf of our time, energy, resources, our staff. And so we stopped the program because it was ineffective. Now, it would be nice for me to show you pictures of kids in the Bronx communicating with kids in rural Laos, and everyone would say, oh, I feel so good. But it was an ineffective usage of our dollar. And so when you have a data-driven approach, I think you make those emotionally tough decisions, but if you're committed to the mission achievement, then it's a no-brainer.
So I wanted to sort of allude to that question that you asked. What do you want most of them?
Yeah.
But I wanted to focus it around how we could apply technology advances to this mission.
Yeah.
And I want to ask the question this way: just sort of think about some of the big things that Google has been working on, Project Blue.
Yeah.
If you could have a bunch of Google engineers for 6 months,
Yeah.
what would you have them do?
Great question. So the underlying, I guess, variable is whether there's Wi-Fi access in our communities, which there is currently not. And so the first thing is I would say bringing Wi-Fi access to every community in which we worked. If I could get that in itself, that would be the moonshot. I think that it's something like 4 billion people are not currently connected. And so if we could connect every single one of our communities into the internet in some capacity, that would be the dream. But because it's probably, let's say, 5 years away, not that far away. But in the meantime, I think there's some really interesting capabilities around mobile access in communities and provision of content, quality content. Because what we see is most people have mobile phones. Certainly in Ghana, they're starting to get them in Guatemala at pretty high rates. Laos is less frequent, but somebody in the community has a mobile phone. And there should be some type of content delivery system within feature phones. So right now, people are mainly focused on smartphones, but the communities where we work don't have those. So I would almost task engineers to say, okay, what is the mobile capacity going to be in this community in the next 3 years? And then how do we build content delivery systems so that they can self-educate?
Time for one more question.
So you maybe familiar with organizations like the Wells and Recommend.
Yeah.
What's your take on, since you're a data-driven company, what's your take about if I give $1 to online no more, let's say the chat app. If I give $1 to your organization, maybe it's going to be really good a bit better by the end of the year. What's your take on comparisons?
Sure. So one, I would never personally knock anyone that's trying to create a positive influence in the world and in the lives of others. So it's hard for me to say this is a bad organization unless they actually do bad things. My personal preference, my genuine belief is that the single most powerful way to bring positivity into the world is through greater access to opportunity. To not dictate what somebody should or shouldn't do, but purely to give them the opportunity to choose. And there's no more powerful way to do that than through education. The second thing is from a data-driven approach. The only measured way that has proven effective to raise a country's GDP is through greater access to education and attainment through educational achievement of primary age children. It's just the only thing that's been proven to lift up GDPs consistently. And so when I look at that, I think, okay, education, now I have the data behind it, I have the personal preference towards it. And in my opinion, it's the only root cause that lifts up all others. So when you look at discrimination issues, when you look at disease, education is the one that just has some type of kind of residual impact on the rest. And my second thing is around health. Health and education tie hand in hand, but my personal passion has always been around education. But if somebody works on, I mean, if you look at, there's an MIT study that tried to say what is the most dollar for dollar effective intervention, it was deworming. Now that said, that's like in a lab, it's theoretical, it's think tanks putting it together. But for me, it's always been access to quality education, in particular for youth. And so I wouldn't knock any other organization, but I think there's something powerful within that. And the last part for me is that the former CEO of Malaria No More said this to me outright. He said, education is the most stupidly solvable issue of our time because we have everything needed to educate every child. So with malaria, there's vaccinations, there's bed nets that may or may not work. With water, you have to dig for aquifers that you're not sure if they're going to show up. With prevention of AIDS or cancer, again, you have to do research. In diabetes, we just don't have the solution known yet. With education, we have everything right now to educate every child on earth. And within that knowledge gives me confidence that it's the thing that I like to work on because I believe I can solve it. Not I, but collectively, we together can actually solve this, which gives me a lot of excitement to work on.
Well, thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you for coming
My pleasure.
and talking with us. It's been really, really cool to have you here.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for coming out.
Books are available in the back, and thank you so much.